Hello and good morning, Cisco Networking Academy instructors taking the Python Programmability Initiative course. In this video tutorial, I'm going to be focusing on the requests HTTP for Humans library. Now, we've already seen how we can access the requests library by importing it into our Python programs. There's another video that was done up. The link to that video is in the description for this video that shows you how to install requests on the Mac platform, on Windows, and on Linux. We've also talked about how you can easily import it into Replit if you're using Replit. This video is going to go the next step and a little bit further into how we would use the requests library and what kind of information we can get back when making RESTful API calls and when we're consuming data off of the programmable web. So the first thing I'd like to talk about, and something that will cause confusion with learners, is I want to compare and contrast the requests library with a number of other libraries that are out there that allow you to interface with programmable services on the web. The first is the urllib library, and it contains a series of modules. As you can see here, there is a request module, an error module, a parse module, and a robot parser module. Now, these are mutually exclusive from the requests HTTP for Humans library. This is actually accessible and does not need to be installed. We can simply import these features and functionality into Python. Now, let me show you an example of how you would do that. If I was to pull up idle, I could simply type in import urllib. And if we use the dir or the directory built-in Python function, you can see that I've actually imported urllib. Now, a common approach to see what might be available under urllib is to say urllib period, and you can hit the tab key. Now, you can see it filled it in with urllib parse. If there were other options, we would see them here. And let me go ahead and backspace up here. And it looks like we're only going to be able to see urllib parse right now. However, you might be able to see other methods that would be working with the urllib module if they existed here. And we will see that when we take a look at requests. So urllib is not something that we have to go out and find and then install. It's actually available with the CPython installation that we used earlier in the course from python.org. Now, again, remember, urllib is different, even though it provides some of the same features and functionality as the requests HTTP for Humans library. This, again, is mutually exclusive. Now, where there tends to be confusion is learners will typically run upon the urllib library and see that there's a request method, thinking that that is the same as the requests library, and it is not. So urllib request will perform some of the same functions that the requests library will perform. However, it does it with a much different syntax in many cases, and it is not as straightforward as the requests HTTP for Humans library. And I'm using HTTP for Humans to differentiate requests from this module that we're looking at here, which is the request. Now, you'll notice at the very top of the urllib.request in Python's own documentation, they actually recommend that you use the requests HTTP for Humans library, and they refer to it here as a package, for higher level HTTP client interface tasks. And again, if you were to click on this link right here, it takes you to the requests HTTP for Humans homepage. So even in the Python documentation, and this is for 3.10.4, the release of Python, they are actually recommending that you use the request package. Now, There is one module here that we're going to be very interested in, and that is the urllib.parse. And this is something where the requests HTTP for humans package or library is a little bit lacking. And we're going to see that once we get into scenarios like when we're using MapQuest and we need to encode certain data into our request, our RESTful API request, maybe we need to put an API key in that request. Maybe we need to put the to destination in that request or the from destination so that MapQuest can take all of that data and information, authenticate our request with our key, start the journey from the or the origination, and then give us all the directions to the destination. And that is where, when we're using the requests HTTP for humans library, we don't have the same ease of use when we're trying to encode or possibly parse out certain information. In fact, if we scroll down here, they give you a nice little example of how you can use urllib.parse, and they're importing URL parse. Now, what would that allow us to do? Well, it's going to parse or break down the URL that we're providing. And as you can see here, they're going to be receiving, or we would be passing in possibly parameters, right? Maybe our API key, maybe our from location, the origination where we're starting our journey, and then the to destination. So these are things that we might possibly want to parse out. And take a look at how easy it is by providing the URL that we're using, how we can then use the different methods for this functionality to get the scheme or the net location or the host name that's being used or the port on which that HTTP request is being made. Now, these terms may look very familiar. In fact, if I come over here to the DevNet Associate course, on the page where you start to learn about REST API requests, you can see that we have the scheme, HTTP. Now, the authority is what the urllib.parse library is referring to as the net location. You can see docs.python.org:80, and that would be what the DevNet course refers to as the authority. And then we have the path to where we're going to be making our query. And then here, delineated by the question mark, is what follows is our query. And if we go back and take a look at urllib.parse, you can see that you can pull that information out of the URL if you wanted to get that information. And so urllib.parse is something we'll be using, and specifically, we're going to be looking at the encoding. And again, it's a great idea to take a look at the different features and functionality that you can get from this package. And you can see here, you could even do a URL split where you can break things down if you wanted to. And it's very simple and straightforward on how you would do that. Now, if we scroll down a little bit further, you'll notice that there are, again, other features and functionality, and this will look similar to what we're doing with the request library. However, it is not using that requests HTTP for humans. This is different. Now, the third and final one that we'll talk about is you'll often see references to urllib3. So we've seen urllib.parse, which is in our Python documentation, and then we have this other project that has written a library of modules that you can use to interface with HTTP or programmable web services that are offering APIs. And you can use this to make requests to get information, specifically the GET request. However, for our course, we won't be using urllib3. We will be using urllib.parse. Specifically, we're going to be taking a look at the URL encode feature and functionality that you can get by accessing urllib.parse. And now let's go ahead and take a look at what this might look like in reality. So how do we use the requests HTTP for humans library or package? Well, the first thing is that we need to import it. Now, I'm using the CPython distribution that we've downloaded from python.org to run these demonstrations. However, remember, we have to install the requests library. And so again, the video link to, or I should say the link to the video in which I walk through how to do that on Linux, Mac, and on the Windows platform, as well as Replit, the link to that video is below. So you have to import or bring requests in and install it on the system you're using, and then we can import it here. So what could I do? Well, remember, we're simply going to be making an HTTP request. This really isn't related to JSON data just yet, and you'll see what I mean. I'm going to do some examples here that'll show you what I mean. So what we could say is, when we make an HTTP request, we're going to receive back a response object. So I could say HTTP response object. And again, I'm just using sort of a self-commenting variable name here that's going to capture or point to somewhere in memory this information here. So I'm going to say requests.get, and we're going to provide it with a URL. Again, we're just simply sending an HTTP GET request to some URL. And so the URL that we'll use first here is http:// and let's say cern.info.ch. And again, I've provided a string argument to the get method so that I'm telling the requests library what is it that I want to get, which HTTP web pages am I interested in getting a response object back for. Well, now that I have this HTTP response object, what I can do is I can say, okay, well, show me the text version of what we received back, that web page that's right there. And if I hit enter, you can see that we've been given a string. And you see the single quote that delimits and terminates all of this information we've received back. So we receive back a string object that is representing that web page in a text format. So what else might we see with our HTTP response object? Well, we could see the HTTP headers. And here is our header information, and it's enclosed inside the curly braces. All of this response information is enclosed in the curly braces, which Python will treat as a dictionary. And although we haven't covered dictionaries quite yet, you might be interested in how you can manipulate or parse some of this information. Well, it's actually not too difficult. I can simply say HTTP response object, and if I was to say headers, what if I said 0? Now, we saw with lists that this is how we can access information from a list. However, we can't do that here. So what we're going to see is with the headers, we can actually use the names, right? And you'll notice that in the headers, we've got sort of this key value pair. So here's the key. The key is date, and the value is the actual information for the date. The key is server, and the actual value would be that it's an Apache web server. The key for the content encoding is that it's gzip. So how do we get to this information? Well, we do it similar to how we did it with a list in Python. However, what we're going to say here is we're actually going to provide simply the name of the key. So what if I said date? Again, this is being given to us in a format that Python's going to look at and say, hey, this is a dictionary. And a dictionary is unordered data. There's no real logic to how the data is ordered, in the sense that it's not that this is index position 0 and that this is index position 1. And that's why I wanted to run this example here, because that's how we access data in an array, in a list, and that list is an ordered number of, or it's an ordered version of elements that are in there. But if I say date, if I simply give the key value here, right, of date, I will get the value that that refers to. So if I said HTTP response object headers, and I wanted to see the information for the last time that this was modified, we could type that in, and you would see that the last time the page was modified shows Thursday, 19 November 2020. And this is how you could simply go through, keeping in mind that these are key value pairs, and the key and the value are separated by a colon, and the key value pairs, because there's multiple key value pairs here, are separated by commas. So the key and the value are separated by a colon, and the key value pairs themselves are separated by commas. And it's that easy to be able to dig down into the information on this web page. Let's take a look at some other examples. I could say HTTP response object, and maybe I want to see the URL that was referenced. That would give me the URL back in a string format. Maybe I wanted to see if the object I received back is okay, if it's a valid object, and we receive back true. What if I wanted to see HTTP response object and then apparent encoding? In other words, how is this information being encoded? And we get back UTF-8. Now, you might have looked up here and said, okay, maybe some of that information that we're getting might be up here in the header information. And we don't see the encoding up here, although what you do see is you see this content encoding, right? However, we don't see that UTF-8, or at least I don't see the UTF-8 up here in the information we receive back. All right, so that is how you import the HTTP, or the requests module, HTTP for humans, into your interactive interpreter session. And this is how you can make a GET request to any website, and then you can parse through the data that you have received in the HTTP response object to pull out or parse information that you might be interested in. Now, one of the things we've seen is that we might want to know what the status code is. In other words, if I make an HTTP GET request using the requests library, what is the response code that I get back? And you can see we get a response code 200 back, which is indicating that we've had general success. Something else you might want to see is you might want to see the content. Now, this is going to look similar to when we had the HTTP response object .text method being used. However, the difference is this is coming back to us as bytecode, and that's what the little b stands for. So again, there's so many things that we can do with that requests library and all of the features and functionality that come with it. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the JSON component. Again, up until now, the JSON hasn't been involved at all in terms of the conversation. We're just getting back basic information from an HTTP GET request. However, let's take a look and see where urllib is going to come into, or the urllib.parse is going to come into play, because right now, if I was to say HTTP response object JSON, and again, if you hit tab, you're going to see a list of all of the different methods that we can use with that response, that HTTP response object that we received back. And if we scroll down to the J, you'll see that there's JSON. However, the data that we're getting back, the HTTP response object, is not giving me back JSON data. Therefore, we're going to receive this error message here, and it was quite verbose. But the problem is it's not JSON data that we're receiving back. So let's go ahead and we're going to sort of pre-stage a URI that would give me back JSON data. And so this is sort of where we run into the conversation of, okay, well, what if I'm making a RESTful request to a web service and I'm getting JSON data back? What am I going to do with that data? And so let's go ahead and say HTTP, and we'll just say response object. So this is our response object we're getting back, and we're going to create a new one. We're going to say requests.get. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a URL that will give me back JSON data. Now, again, this is sort of a little contrived because the JSON data is already there. We're not having to formulate the RESTful call to get the JSON data back. The JSON data is already there, which is why we can use the requests library to do this using a simple requests.get, an HTTP GET request. So now when I hit enter, if I say HTTP response object JSON, because we have received JSON data back, there is my JSON data. Now you might be wondering here, okay, earlier when you used the key value pairs from what we received back from the HTTP response object headers, I was able to pull information out. I wonder if you can do the same thing here. Well, let's see. Maybe I want to know if the message I received back is a success. We want to check on that possibly. Now, you could see, or you could say HTTP response object dot status code, but this is for our HTTP request. And we received a status code of 200. What about this JSON data that we received back? Let's go ahead and say HTTP response object. Now, if I say .json and I do this, is there a way for me to do something like this, to say message and receive only the value that is associated with this key value pair, and the key value pair is being separated by a colon? Is this going to work? And it does. Now remember, we're using the interactive interpreter here, and the interactive interpreter is something that if I'm not creating variables to capture information, that I would need to do that. It's not as if we've written a program here. So maybe I want to just capture the JSON status. And to do that, I would simply say JSON status, HTTP response object.json, because I just want to know, is the message status successful? And I can do this. Then I could say JSON status, and we have the string success in there. So you could use a print command and say something like the following. I just made a request for JSON data, and the code received was, now remember, this is a string data type that we're working with. So what I could do is I could go ahead and concatenate these strings together. And so I could simply say, terminate the single quote there, put the plus sign, and put in JSON status. And let's see what we get back when this print command runs. And there we go. I just made a request for JSON data, and the code received was success. Now, that is a simple description and example as to how we can access that JSON data. In the next video tutorial I'm going to do, we're now going to start to take a look at how we can create some variables that have maybe our origination, our destination, our API MapQuest, or our MapQuest API key, and maybe the main URI that we would be using, and how we can encode that key information, right? And that's maybe a better choice of words there would be how to encode the different key value pairs that we need to pass to the programmable web service, the API that MapQuest is providing to get data back. All right, so hopefully this has provided a good foundation around the requests library, the HTTP for humans, how we would use that, how we get information, because we are going to be using this to get JSON data back from the MapQuest API. It's just that we need a second component, and that's going to be the urllib.parse library or package that we saw earlier. All right, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully this video has provided some clarity around the requests module, how to use it, things we can get from it. And as always, I hope to see you in the next video. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you very much.